Hey, good afternoon. Hi, everybody. I'm Stesha Brandon. I'm the Literature and Humanities Program Manager here at the Seattle Public Library. As we start today, I'd like to respectfully acknowledge that we are gathered on the ancestral lands of many indigenous peoples, particularly those of the Coast Salish region. This includes the Duwamish, Suquamish, and Muckleshoot peoples, among others, who have lived in relationship with the land and waters of the Puget Sound since time immemorial. I'll also mention that if you are interested in learning more about colonization and its impact on Native people and their lands, the library is a great place to start. We have lots of resources. Thanks so much for coming today. Welcome to today's program, which is presented in partnership with Suru for Solidarity, Minidoka Pilgrimage, and the James and Grace Lee Boggs Foundation. I have just a couple quick announcements before we get started. First, I'd like to thank our partners and sponsors. We're grateful to the Seattle Times for their generous support of library programs, and we're very grateful to the Seattle Public Library Foundation, whose support helps the library provide free programs and services that touch the lives of everyone in our community. Now, I am delighted to introduce our program. The Seattle Public Library is one of nearly 190 libraries on the West Coast that have been celebrating One Book, One Coast this spring. The project has highlighted George Takei's graphic memoir, They Called Us Enemy. Over the last couple months, we've scheduled a number of programs that have given folks an opportunity to learn more about the incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II and the various perspectives and feelings of those impacted. And we are so delighted to host Soctt Kurashige to talk about his book, American Peril, which offers broader context about the long history of anti-Asian racism in the U.S. Today's program is going to begin with poetry from local writer Troy Osaki, and this will be followed by a presentation from Soctt and then comments from the University of Washington's Dr. Vince Schleitwiler and Anna Tanaka from Suru for Solidarity. I'm going to tell you a little bit about each of those folks, and then we're going to get started. So Troy Osaki is a Filipino-Japanese poet, organizer, and attorney, a 3-time Grand Slam poetry champion. He's received fellowships from Kundiman, Artist Trust, and the Poetry Foundation. His work appears in journals such as Poetry and the Missouri Review, as well as The Gate of Memory and an anthology by descendants of Nikkei wartime incarceration. Soctt Kurashige is author of The Shifting Grounds of Race, Black and Japanese Americans in the Making of Multi-Ethnic Los Angeles, and co-author with Grace Lee Boggs of The Next American Revolution, Sustainable Activism for the 21st Century. And his new book is American Peril, the Violent History of Anti-Asian Racism. Vince Schleitwiler teaches comparative ethnic studies and Japanese American studies at the University of Washington. He's the author of Strange Fruit of the Black Pacific, and his writing has appeared in African American Review, Amerasia Journal, The Margins, The International Examiner, and elsewhere. A Yonsei, or fourth-generation Japanese American, he is a descendant of incarcerees at Salinas, Santa Anita, and Poston. Anna Tanaka is Yonsei Gosi, fourth, fifth-generation Japanese American and descendant of Minidoka and Gila River survivors. She works with Suru for Solidarity on the police and prison detention and child and family detention campaigns. Anna graduated from the University of Washington in 2023 with a degree in American Ethnic Studies and Human Evolutionary Biology and currently works at the UW Women's Center. Please help me welcome all of these amazing speakers.
All right, good afternoon. Hello. All right, if you're excited to celebrate today's book and multiracial solidarity, can you make some noise? Okay. Beautiful. Okay. Lovely. Again, my name is Troy, he, him. I'm a poet, born and raised here in Seattle. Just very excited to be here with you all. I'm also the nephew of Uncle Soctt and Auntie Emily. Like his children, I am also mixed Filipino-Japanese. Shout out all the mixed people. And I have just the honor of being able to open up today's space with some poetry. And I wanted to start just with a quick just portion from today's book, American Peril, the Violent History of Anti-Asian Racism. So I'll start with this and then go into some poems. This is from the epilogue portion, 5 Lessons from History to Stop Anti-Asian Violence. And this first part is from the first lesson, and then I'll end with a quick sentence from the last lesson. Broadly speaking, the sources, purposes, and effects of anti-Asian racism and violence cannot be understood without this type of transnational perspective. As author Viet Thanh Nguyen stated in October 2023, we must not forget that the greatest acts of anti-Asian violence are carried out in America's wars in Asia. There is, when added, total continuity between what the United States has done in the Philippines, in Korea, in Japan, in Laos, in Cambodia, in Vietnam, and now with Palestine. Tragically, the war hatreds have not been isolated, but cumulative. True solutions can only come from grassroots action for systemic change based on multiracial solidarity and self-determination. This is an erasure poem of Executive Order 9066, so the document that allowed the government back in the 1940s to round up Japanese folks. The erasure portion is basically blacking out parts of the document to create a new document. It's Executive Order 9066. Order war. Whereas war. Navy war. Secret war. War of war. December war. War of land, of nation, here under the White House. Ode to the basketball sailing over a barbed wire fence after Martin Espada. Praise Puyallup, city of daffodils named after the tribe, meaning generous. Home to Washington's largest state fair and 7,390 incarcerated Japanese. Praise the Collins Playfield director, tossing a billion burnt orange planets over the fence like a meteor shower. The smell of a gymnasium stiff in the air. Praise the afternoon pickup games in the parking lots where school children once passed invisible ball after invisible ball to each other, the sun staring. Praise every child whose dad is separated in a different camp, far off in Montana or Louisiana, missing their behind-the-back dribble. Praise the first teenager to launch a rubber rock high over a guard tower onto the moon, then fall asleep in a chicken shed with his brother. Praise the courtside cheers in their heads, their mascot, a single light bulb dangling inside a barrack, or a laundry line of damp clothes. Praise the smooth globe flying to Manzanar, to Heart Mountain, to a desert at New Mexico where scientists test the atomic bomb at twilight. Praise the crystal ball-sized sphere crashing into Franklin D. Roosevelt's face as he burns a pile of banned books written in Japanese at the White House. Praise the teeth falling from the president's mouth, his gapped smile full of wind from the Atlantic. 7,390 Japanese in Puyallup listen to him whistle. Praise Camp Harmony, named unofficially for families waiting to be sent to concentration camps. A stampede of basketballs hails from the sky. All right. Thank you. Okay. I'll read maybe just two or three more pieces, and then we'll continue on with the program. But so my family, my grandma in particular, was I was around 12 years old during the war, and her family were in most of them in Minidoka, but then her dad was a Buddhist minister at the time, and so he was taken to various prison camps around the country, given he was seen as a higher level of security threat to the nation. And so this next poem is from the point of view of my grandma's mother, so my great-grandma. She had to take care of 7 kids on her own during the war as her husband was separated. So this is of laundry in camp. I've lived in your sweat, scrubbed sunlight out of your shirt collars, sweat spots the size of lemons. We've spent all summer in the desert, and still you smell like my children. A spool of ribbon from the dime store, a fresh copy of the Batman. Riverless, I dip your clothes into a bucket of soapy water. I touch the hemlines that have touched your elbows, your bones. Remind me of strawberries in July, shimmering. This country can't make me think otherwise. In your dresses and in your slacks, your pockets are filled with rocks. I iron your dad's necktie. I wear it when I'm alone. All right. Perfect. Okay. I'll end with one more poem. As a writer here in Seattle, I've also been doing as much organizing as I can. I've been part of an effort with the Tango Migrante movement. It's a movement of different organizations that are addressing issues of overseas Filipinos. So different migrant issues, from trafficking to issues of violence against women, and then many of which are also detention issues. So, I've been trying to plug in as an attorney as much as possible to support Filipinos on the inside right now in Tacoma. Tango Migrante has been able to help about 5, 6, 7 Filipinos released from detention. And then through that work, I'm also right now I've been able to work with a lot of really amazing progressive lawyers. So I'm working to build an organization called People's Lawyers for Philippine Liberation. We're gonna do it. We're gonna make a little lawyer organization. It'll be community based, and this poem came out of some of that work that I've been doing, and so. It's called In Detention. Thank you all so much for having me. I have some broadsides or some small poems that I'm selling over there if anyone wants to chop it up and check it out. But excited for the rest of the program. So this is In Detention. I visit Kuya. The walls are windowless and drowsy in detention. I look up. The sky is missing. You can't plant a tree in detention. In Sorsogon City, my comrade is arrested. She eats boiled spinach, saltless. The warden spits, calls her small as a flea in detention. She points her finger in his face, says, she'll fight for her land until the end of the world. Until all 60 in her cell are free. In detention, Kuya convinced Stretch to request a transfer to his pod. Now, all the Filipinos are housed together in Unit G3 in detention. Forklift drivers, lab technicians, a seasonal roofer in Alaska. Our people find each other even when overseas in detention. Fort Bliss is miles west of the camp my family was taken to. It was war. My grandma's neighbor was a Nazi in detention. Troy, she's of the same barbed wire you walk past to visit Kuya. She sipped water from rusted pipes as if and we're T in detention. All right, thank you all so much.
Thank you so much for that. Yeah, I was just thinking while Troy was doing his poetry that we're both here in large measure because of his grandmother, who's my mom's older sister, in part because they're a big part of Seattle history. They grew up first on 10th Street, and then they were forced to move when Yesler Terrace was built, and then they ended up at 14th and Jackson, and of course they were uprooted through World War II. So in that metaphorical sense, but also in a literal sense, because as I was doing some research into family history, so my grandfather was taken by the FBI before everybody else and sent to all these enemy alien camps. And then after going to Puyallup, Minidoka, the rest of the family, as Troy was talking about, reunited at Crystal City. And that was where the sort of like high-risk enemy aliens were held. There were even some Germans and Italians there too. And so a lot of people there didn't even get to leave after the war was over. And so, you know, as much as they had built a life here and were central to the Seattle community, they, my grandparents really felt like, you know, they weren't welcome here anymore. And so they actually went through the process of going back to Japan, which meant all the US-born children would actually give up their citizenship and be expatriated. And it was really because of Troy's grandmother, my mom's older sister, that refused to go, that the family stayed. They argued, I guess, over for quite a while. And my auntie Etsuko was very strong-willed, and so they stayed. And that's literally the only reason we're here today, is because of her actions. She was very active in helping the Densho Project collect stories, my grandmother, her story, and other members of our family. But before I begin my presentation, I need to make an important announcement. So, if you came here today expecting to see George Takei, his presentation will take place tomorrow. Same bat time, same bat channel. Oh my! Okay, being part of the One Book, One Coast series, just couldn't resist that opportunity to give my tribute to George Takei, to thank the Seattle Public Library for inviting me and all of us to be part of this series. Special thanks to Stacia Brandon and all the library staff who make not just events like this possible, but do so much to support all authors and their books. Thank you, Seattle librarians. I'd like to thank the Minidoka Pilgrimage and Sudu for Solidarity for co-sponsoring this event. Their work is so important. Thank you to my partner, Emily Lawson, who is selling books and items on behalf of the James and Gracie Boggs Foundation, which is a nonprofit I work with. As I mentioned, thanks to Troy. I always think of Troy. Troy was supposed to be Rocky Osaki, right? But then his mom had a word about that, and so we have Troy with us. Thanks to Anna Tanaka and Vince Schleitwiler for adding their brilliance to this event. And thank everybody for coming out today. Before I get into the reading, just a content advisory. This is a book that's about confronting racism and white supremacy, and that's part of the content of this discussion today. So the first thing that motivated me to write this book is because, like most people in the US, I learned next to nothing about Asian American studies in my K-12 education. That ignorance, sadly, is not a void. It's a conscious erasure with the space filled by misinformation and distortion, which has for decades rendered Asian Americans and Asians subject to racist stereotyping and scapegoating. My title, American Peril, echoes the classic work by historian Alexander Saxton, The Indispensable Enemy, who argued that white labor organizations in the 19th century became a political force by pushing the movement for Chinese exclusion to the center of political contestation. So we see time and time again that the work of Asian Americans is essential to economic development and profit making in the US. Yet the lives of Asian American workers are disposable. Preserving the story of America as a land of opportunity and progress has meant burying those stories with the bodies of Asian laborers. Now, when we link the history of Asian Americans to US imperialism and overseas expansion, we see that militarism in Asia, including the willingness to murder hundreds of thousands of people to achieve strategic objectives, has been absolutely essential to the rise of the US as a superpower. Yet, to preserve the mythology of American exceptionalism, the fictive notion that the US is a uniquely benevolent force for freedom and democracy in the world, it has been just as essential for those stories of massacres, of torture, of sexual assault, and of war crimes to be covered up. The second motivation for this book brings me to focus more specifically on the problem of anti-Asian violence in my lifetime. In 1989, I was a college sophomore and I saw the film Who Killed Vincent Chin? The story of a 27-year-old Chinese American beaten to death near Detroit in a racist crime by two white men who were given an extremely lenient sentence of probation and a fine. The story of Vincent Chin is powerful not just because it exposes the systemic problem of anti-Asian racism, but because it sparked a nationwide movement led by Asian American activists, but rooted in multiracial solidarity against white supremacy. And that leads to my third motivation, which is to challenge the model minority myth and highlight the overlooked history of Asian American activism and resistance. And so this book draws from 3+ decades of both my scholarly research and my community activism and organizing, addressing the problem of anti-Asian violence, which finally attracted mass media attention amid thousands of anti-Asian incidents during the COVID-19 pandemic. But we've also seen how many of those same media outlets moved on to the next flavor of the month, which leaves the important work to the rest of us, to show that what happened 5-6 years ago was not unprecedented. It did not arise out of thin air or only because of the spewing of one orange-colored man, and it did not end when the media spotlight faded. And so while this series draws crucial attention to the ongoing relevance of mass incarceration during World War II, I want us to connect that history to the longer pattern of anti-Asian racism. So I've chosen to read an excerpt from the book that takes us back to the early years of Japanese immigration, and it helps us to see how legalized racism and xenophobia are connected to racist violence, and why anti-Japanese racism must be connected to the broader multiracial struggle for immigrant rights. So this is from the book, chapter 3. On May 7th, 1891, a 25-year-old Japanese woman named Nishimura Ekyu was detained by immigration officials on arrival in San Francisco. Her appeal ultimately reached all the way up to the US Supreme Court, which decided the case on January 18th, 1892. That decision, however, sent an unfortunate signal that Japanese immigrants were unlikely to evade the type of exclusionary measures imposed on Chinese migrants. While Congress had passed exclusion acts specific to China, it had also moved in 1882 and 1891 to restrict immigration across the board. And it enacted new categorical bans, such as on those believed to have contagious diseases, and, quote, people likely to become a public charge. So Nishimura was barred on that latter basis because immigration officials accused her of lying about being married and coming to reunite with her husband. Now, the Immigration Act of 1891 further created strict grounds for enforcement, putting bases for deportation into legislation for the first time, and granting control over enforcement to a federal, quote-unquote, superintendent. Nishimura filed a writ of habeas corpus, something we're still struggling over today, asserting that her detention was unconstitutional and that she was denied her due process right to defend herself in court. But through Nishimura's case and 3 others involving Chinese and Japanese immigrants between 1889 and 1903, the US Supreme Court made clear that the federal government's control over entry and, with some qualifications, deportation of immigrants was not subject to judicial review. These foundational cases established the basis for the INS and a century later, ICE, to wield enormous power over the fate of immigrants, as well as create a climate of fear and precarity. While many Korean and Japanese left Hawaii seeking better conditions in California and the West Coast, they could not outrun the exclusion movement, which broadened scope to target successive groups of Asians. On the global stage, Japan commanded more respect from the US after defeating China and especially Russia in war. Yet this simultaneously created a new level of Yellow Peril fear and loathing. For instance, the journalist Willard Straight privately confessed to a friend while covering the 1904-05 Russo-Japanese War, quote, "For no particular reason, with no real cause for complaint, I now find myself hating the Japanese more than anything in the world. It is due, I presume, to the constant strain of having to be polite and to seek favors from the yellow people." Before the war was over, Straight concluded that the Japanese were, quote, "very much less human than the others." Now, he later served as a prominent advisor to President William Howard Taft on East Asian foreign policy, as hostility toward Japan intensified. And as Straight was a wealthy Cornell University alumnus and donor, the university named its student union in his honor after he died in the Spanish flu pandemic. It's still named for him. The spread of Yellow Peril sentiment, particularly among white labor agitators, took hold domestically, centered in California. In 1905, the Asiatic Exclusion League formed and secured a pledge by San Francisco to force Japanese American students into segregated schools. The following year, a world-renowned Japanese seismologist came to study the Great Earthquake and was physically assaulted in both San Francisco and Eureka. These international incidents provoked President Theodore Roosevelt to end Japanese labor migration to the US. California, Washington, and other states passed exclusionary measures such as alien land laws, preventing Japanese immigrants from owning land. In the early 1920s, the Supreme Court affirmed the ban on land ownership and ruled definitively that Japanese could not become naturalized citizens. Congress capped off the anti-Japanese exclusion movement with the 1924 Immigration Act, targeting Japan with a ban on admission of any, quote, alien ineligible to citizenship. So during this era of separate but equal, the courts served to articulate the fictive belief that the nation could discriminate against Asians without being racist. In 1922, the Supreme Court unanimously ruled in the case of Takao Ozawa versus the US that Japanese immigrants were barred from becoming naturalized citizens. Arguing for the federal government, the US Solicitor General stated that the Founding Fathers, who in 1790 designated naturalization rights only for, quote, free white persons, intended that citizenship be granted, quote, only to those whom they knew and regarded as worthy to share it with them, men of their own type, white men. But he immediately felt compelled to add, quote, this does not imply the drawing of any narrow or bigoted racial lines. The justices similarly went out of their way to disclaim any racist intent. Writing on behalf of all 9 justices, George Sutherland, echoing the Ozawa decision, stated in the 1923 Thind ruling barring immigrants from India also from citizenship, quote, it is very far from our thought to suggest the slightest question of racial superiority or inferiority. What we suggest is merely racial difference. The evasive language of judges stood in stark contrast to the violence that confronted Asian immigrants rendered vulnerable by this denial of basic rights. As with Chinese in the US, the Japanese immigrants most subjected to physical attacks, with some noteworthy exceptions, belonged to the working class. The first significant wave of immigrants from Japan came to the Kingdom of Hawaii in the 1880s as contract workers through an arrangement with the sovereign Native Hawaiian government, before it was overthrown by American business interests and annexed to the US. They worked on plantations, mainly growing sugar, like my great-grandfather did, where Chinese had previously worked. Whites were prepared to keep them in their place. One of the most notorious instances of violence in this era was the lynching of Katsugoto by a group of white men on October 29, 1889. At the age of 23, Goto had come on the first ship of contract workers from Japan, arriving with over 900 others in February 1885. Goto was assigned to work on a white-owned sugar plantation on the Big Island. Not only did he complete his 3-year indenture, Goto managed to save enough money to open a general store in the town of Honoka'a. As the only Japanese-owned store in the area, his business thrived, and Goto was respected by the workers from nearby plantations as a leader of the Japanese community. 2 months before his murder, Goto moved next door to a larger building, arousing the ire of a neighboring business owned by Joseph R. Mills. In the eyes of whites, the upstart entrepreneur had refused to stay in his place. Even worse, Goto, remembering his roots on the plantation, helped workers advocate for their rights in a manner that upset the power structure. When a fire broke out on Robert Overend's plantation, the owner blamed Japanese workers for starting it and Goto for instigating. Overend warned Goto he would be killed if he came back to the plantation to meet the workers again. When Goto defied the warning, he was ambushed on his way home and pulled off of his horse. A group of white men connected to Overend and Mills hung Goto from a telephone pole. 4 white men, including Mills, but not Overend, were tried for murder and convicted of lesser manslaughter charges. 2 of them escaped from prison. Following the overthrow, Mills was pardoned by the white planter government in 1894. Only one of the convicted served his entire sentence. So that's an excerpt from the book, and just want to invite the conversation partners to join me on stage. Thank you.
Well, welcome. My name is Vince Schleitwiler. I teach at UW. And I'll be leading discussion. Every people just quickly introduce themselves.
Yeah, hi. My name's Anna Tanaka, she, her, and I am part of Tsudu as well as the Minidoka Pilgrimage Planning Committee.
Yeah, hello again, Troy.
You know. Yeah. So I wanted to start off, I have to say my head is kind of spinning right now because there's so much that came out of that short reading in the introduction to the book as well as the poetry. I also came here earlier this morning. I was down at an event at the King County Airport that was organized by La Resistencia to end deportation flights out of King County Airport. King County is the public airport. Is a public airport for our county, and it is a place that is a site of really the horrific conditions of deportation flights that are coming out there. And you know, thinking about that and thinking about the presentation, I have to say that I'm really struck by how often when we talk about Japanese American incarceration, which is sort of the kind of theme of the larger series, because people have worked so hard to tell those stories that were suppressed, that often we tell them in a very narrow way, right? We tell them as a story that is about the experience of a single ethnic group, right? We tell them as a story that is about a very specific set of years, 1942 to 1946. We're only just, you know, coming around to the fact, like, yeah, we always talk about 1942 as because we're talking about Executive Order 966. We don't really include, even in that moment, the experience of the immigrant community leaders rounded up after Pearl Harbor, right? So when we use that date, we're kind of leaving out part of this story. And so I really appreciate how both the book and the event situate that history of incarceration in a much longer story. And in particular, that you began today in the reading by talking about Akio Nishimura and about how the targeting of Japanese immigrants was central to the establishment and codification of a whole system of immigrant detention control following the targeting of Chinese immigrants, right? And then also thinking about later in the book, at the end of the book, or towards the end of the book, you talk about your visit to the Northwest Detention Center in 2024 for a Liberation of Bon event, which was held, which was organized by Pseudo for Solidarity as part of La Resistencia's Solidarity Day. So Northwest Detention Center being the immigrant prison camp in our area. The Northwest Detention Center, which is, and pardon me, I said my head is buzzing, so I'm thinking of these connections. The Northwest Detention Center is the successor facility to the old immigration station in the International District, now known as the Inscape Arts Building, which was where Japanese immigrants who were rounded up by the FBI under the Alien Enemies Act were first held. So I just wanted to express, first of all, my deep appreciation for kind of resituating the story of Japanese American incarceration in that longer history, right? The history not just of anti-Asian violence, but of all the organizing that has happened in response to that, that often focuses on the mistreatment and detention of immigrants. And so I actually wanted to invite Anna and Troy to talk about the organizations that you're working with that are continuing this history of organizing.
Well, yeah. So I work with Tsuru for Solidarity, which is an organization that is made up of Japanese American social justice advocates and allies, working to shut down the Northwest Detention Center as well as concentration camps around the country. And there are three main campaigns: the Prisons, Police, and Detention / Child and Family Detention campaign, as well as Black Reparations and Healing Justice. And so the PPD / CFD, Police Prison, that longer one, we work closely with La Resistencia, as Vince mentioned, to shut down NWDC, which is right in our backyard in Tacoma. And they are famously known for their violation of human rights, awful health conditions, and terrible sanitation, and unfortunately multiple deaths from the psychological torture of solitary confinement. And so as part of our commitment to La Resistencia's work, we host Solidarity Days, which was also mentioned earlier, outside Northwest Detention Center. And so we play taiko, play music, make a lot of noise, do some chants, as well as hear from people inside of the building through Zoom. And so we have also held vigils for folks inside and plan to make a sort of on-call system where we can more easily and more proactively plan to go down there when someone is on hunger strike, which unfortunately has been happening a lot more often. Folks have been using their bodily autonomy, which is the only thing that they can really control as a form of protest against their inhumane treatment. And we also have these kinfolk, which is the name of these cardboard human-like figures that Aaron Shigaki, a public artist and activist, has created the idea of that community members have gotten involved in. And kinfolk, the name, is an interesting combination of kin, which means gold in Japanese, as well as kinfolk, the word, is, family, community. And so we wanted to humanize the folks that are inside as part of our golden community. These are our brothers and sisters. And so the idea is we bring these two different actions to kind of humanize the folks inside, as well as symbolically give these folks inside a voice that they cannot express outside of their confine. Thank you for demonstrating. Along with that, we also do flight monitoring at the King County Airport, which is also known as Boeing Field, where there is no public oversight of folks going in and out. And people have been transported places, and we don't exactly know where they're going, but folks monitor those flights remotely, and then volunteers can go and document what's going on, and we plan to strategically use that documentation to pressure ICE out of the King County Airport. And speaking of, there was also, I don't know if it's still going, but at King County Airport, La Resistencia could not be here today because they are currently at the airport demonstrating and just showing up and being present for folks that are being either put on planes or taken off planes, and showing that we're there, making noise, saying that they're not alone. And yeah, so that's the gist of Tsuru. They do a lot more than even just in Washington, but that's the little bit that we do here in Seattle.
Yeah, give it up for Tsuru. Thank you, Anna. Again, Troy, I started sharing a little bit, but I work with a group called Tango Migrante Movement. In Filipino, it translates to defend migrants. And we've gotten to partner with Zuru and LR a few times, and have just have appreciated the partnerships. And I know I don't know. There's historically so much work you all have done, and it's been great to work together. But Tango Migrante has it launched in right around when the new administration came into office, with the perspective that things were going to continue to worsen, which they did. And so different organizations came together under this banner of Defend Migrants, and a lot of the beginning of the work was focused on, supporting those who were being detained at the detention center in Tacoma. And so some of the first fights we took up were with, for example, Auntie Lynn, who is or maybe retired now, but a UW med tech at the UW Medical Center, has been part of our community for decades, and she was stopped and detained at the airport while she was coming back from the Philippines. And we were able to work with her union, her family, and she eventually was released, which is great. And then we continued working with other folks as well. The goal was really to not just support folks in the immediate, but also call for accountability from especially the Philippine state, who continues to ignore and neglect its Philippine nationals. And so, one big question that we really reflect on too is just this question of why are people migrating in the first place, especially from the Philippines. And so that's part of the reason why the quote that I shared from American Peril at the beginning of my set really stood out to me, was this this idea that many folks who come over, in a lot of ways, came over for better opportunity because they couldn't find it in their home country, right? And so a lot of it is because of displacement, dislocation, often caused by imperialism, and in particular U.S. imperialism. And so addressing this question of why are people moving in the first place is really important. I just came from, right before this, I was at a tribute for a good friend of mine, Lyle Frijoles. I know a few folks know him. I think my auntie did some poetry with him back in the day. But Lyle is another Filipino, community organizer, and for quite some time he has been going back to the Philippines to immerse with farmers and peasants who are experiencing exploitation, and based, off of their labor, many other people are profiting, right? And so he's been going back to these communities to immerse with them, learn about their struggles, and also address them with them and fight for the rights and welfare of farmers and peasants. And last month he was killed in a massacre with another friend of mine, Kai Sorum. And so I actually just got back from the Philippines. I went on a fact-finding mission to investigate what happened, and got to say my goodbyes. And but all of that to say, this connection of imperialism and this longer historical context really connects all these struggles, and that's why it is really important to have these multiracial coalitions, alliances, and to really work together, because all the imperialists, right, work together, and they're dominating. So the people have to come together, right, to fight back together. And so a lot of that will be, highlighted in this book if you read it too. So please go get it.
Actually, I want to just say a couple other words about La Resistencia before there's other kind of questions in the group here. And I want to be clear, I don't speak for La Resistencia. but I wanted to say a little bit about them since they couldn't be here today. And we do have some information about them as well as information about Tsuru that people can check out afterwards. La Resistencia is a group that Tsuru and folks in the Japanese American community have been really privileged to work with for a number of years now. They're a grassroots immigrant-led group that organizes across the prison barrier, is the way that they put it. And so they're led by people who have been directly impacted or experienced or have loved ones who have experienced immigrant detention. And they work in particular to follow the leadership of the organizing that's happening inside. And so you may have seen news stories recently about what came out. What La Resistencia announced was that they received word of the founding of a union of people kidnapped by ICE within the detention center that was organizing across actually several different detention centers. And one of the key organizers, whose name I want to try to make sure I get right, Rogelio Bolofe Izquierdo, was, because of this organizing, was transferred to another location. In fact, I believe, I may be wrong about this, but my understanding is that he'd already been transferred from organizing at another detention center. But as a result of this, now there is a connection happening and organizing happening between these centers. And I found that really powerful as somebody who studies and teaches Japanese American incarceration, because I think about how long it took for people to recover the histories of organizing that were happening at the time. To remember, some of you may know the story of the Heart Mountain Fair Play Committee, the draft resistors, who kind of spoke out against being forced into military service. It took a long time for that story to come out. It took a longer time to hear more about a group called the Mother Society of Minidoka, women who were organizing as mothers to protest and send letters to the U.S. government. I think also about the Tule Lake Defense Committee, which organized on behalf of people who were tricked into citizenship renunciation so that they could be deported, that managed to find support from a famous lawyer named Wayne Collins, and through their organizing managed at the last minute to stop a mass deportation, right? And so these kind of histories of organizing took a long time to get out, but we're already hearing about the kind of things that are going on inside. And so that was something that I wanted to contribute. But again, if you want to hear more about these organizations, you can stop by and talk to us afterwards.
Would you like a broad question or a more specific question? Okay. Well, I'll do a broad one since we were just talking about Liberation Obon, and I just want to highlight that Liberation Obon is something we do usually in the summertime. Bonodori or Obon is like kind of a traditional Japanese festival celebrating our ancestors, and so we kind of have translated that / made it into something that we could bring to NWDC. As I mentioned, taiko music, and making it more of like a spiritual thing that's showing like we are there for the people inside as well as our ancestors, and fighting for and being the voice of our ancestors when they also had no one to speak out for them. And so my question for Scott is, you mentioned that you've mentioned Liberation Obon in your book, and so I was just wondering, what was that experience like for you visiting NWDC for the first time, and or if you've been there multiple times, what's it like to kind of understand what is going on there while also understanding your own family history?
Yeah, my family goes back like 20-something or more generations, in the Buddhist church going back to Japan. So my grandfather was the Rinban here at Seattle Betsuin, where they have a huge Obon, like a lot of people. It's like one of the big events, all of Seattle. So I grew up, just thinking of Obon as like a carnival. You go, you eat snow cones, you play ring toss. But it's only as I got older that I realized, it's a celebration because you're really honoring the dead. It's not just a somber occasion. We're grateful for all they provide us, and their spirit lives on through us. My grandfather lives on, my grandmother, they live on through our spirit. But I think it's also was so important that we are connecting that to the struggles of other peoples, right? So that was just so important to see that we're honoring the dead, but there are people dying. There are Asian Americans, there are Latinos, there are African immigrants, there are people dying in custody today because, again, going back to the late 19th century, the Supreme Court said, no, you don't have that right to due process, when it comes to being excluded or being deported. And that, I think, is really important because when there is a law or a ruling or a practice repressing immigrants or undocumented people or Asian people or Latino people or people suspected of being communists or subversives or terrorists, like once those practices are in place, they don't say, oh, well, we're only going to use it in this one instance for this one group. Like what we see is a recursive, like literally, like we've got people in the current administration even citing, like Executive Order 9066 as things that can be, used against quote unquote terrorist or national security threats today. I mean, so I think those connections are really important. And the connection is also, once people can be stripped of their rights and dehumanized in that way, they can not just be detained, they can be killed with impunity. I mean, there used to be a law in Washington Territory and in California that if you're a Chinese, you couldn't even testify in court against a white person. So literally, it was like a license to kill and to rob and to exploit. But even going back to, in the writing of this book, like things I should have known, but I didn't know, like after the US dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima, in his first radio address, President Truman, who privately said, I feel terrible having to wipe out a whole population of people, but the pig-headedness of these, like Japanese leaders gives me no other choice. So he rationalized it. But what he told the public in his first radio address was, we attacked an important Japanese army base. So he couldn't say this was a city and thousands of women, children, elders, civilians were killed. He had to say, oh, this was a military strike against an army base to bring the war to an end.
I know that in a minute we're going to want to take some questions from the audience. And I think we want to sort of give people a chance to think about it, but also possibly take a couple questions at once so we can make sure we hear from everybody. While you're sort of thinking about your questions, I wanted to actually invite other folks on the panel as well to talk about what it is like to go to the detention center, having a kind of family history of incarceration. I know that there's a long tradition of pilgrimages to sites of incarceration. Minidoka Pilgrimage is one of the sponsors of this event, and I know that as somebody who, my family was incarcerated at Santa Anita and Salinas and Poston. For me, going to NWDC feels like a pilgrimage at times, and I was wondering if folks want to say what it's like for them.
It's a really conflicting experience being there. I think the first time being there was definitely there's some kind of disconnect from what you think it's going to be like and what it's actually like when you're there. You expect it to be this really scary place and I don't know what you might all expect, but I just was like, oh my gosh, what's going to be there? And you get there, and it looks like one of those buildings that's like a corporate building that, well, not Microsoft, but one of the old Microsoft type buildings, because it's intentionally hidden. It's intentionally something that people don't really care to look at. People drive by very easily. It's in the industrial district in Tacoma, and no offense, but I literally would never want to be there for any other reason than to be there protesting this place. And so I think for me when I'm there, it's very, it's interesting because there's so many parallels to our grandparents and folks that we know that were incarcerated. And the barbed wire is really just switched out for a fence that they have now put this black sheet over so that you actually can't see folks getting off of the bus. And so when we're there trying to support them, we can't actually see them and they can't see us. But we're out there making noise anyway. And so I don't know. I think for me it's just a really weird place to be because it feels historic at the same time. You're living in it, but it's also this very historic moment that you're living through. And it's weird because it's the concept of a concentration camp is very impossible to conceive or to understand. And so all we see is this very boring building, and yet this atrocity is happening inside. So I don't know what my whole point is really with that, but mainly that if anyone has the inclination to be a part of that noise that we make outside, you know, like, it's not actually, I don't know if this is the right word for it, but it's not actually that scary, because what's going on is all inside. And so, you know, if you're looking for any inspiration or any motivation to go down there, you know, just do it. Like, there are folks, and we'll be there, and we're there for the people inside. Anyway, so yeah, I think those are just my scramble of thoughts. Yeah.
I think two things come to mind. It's both just a very sad, depressing, dehumanizing place to be, but also it's filled with a lot of resistance and people who are just very strong. So, you know, when you go in, you know, even as an attorney, when I go into the attorney rooms, right, like you're getting wanded, you have to, you know, you can't bring, you can't bring anything inside. I mentioned this in the poem, but as you walk back to the attorney rooms, there are just no windows, like there is no natural light, and some folks end up not actually even being able to see the light for a little while, some for a few weeks at a time. It's just, it's very, I don't know, just not a great place to be. And then you hear about the different stories of, you know, spoiled food, of the you know, aggressive staff and staff that retaliates against people who try to do something about the conditions. And you know, at the same time, though, I remember I was meeting with the kuya. Kuya just means like older brother, and it's like a term of endearment. But I was meeting with the kuya, and I think it might have been one of the first times we were talking. We were in the attorney room together, and I noticed he had like a band around his ring finger, or it wasn't like a rubber band, because I don't think they have access to rubber bands, but maybe he found like a band from like a rubber glove or something, and he just had it wrapped around his finger. And I asked him about it. I was like, what's going on? Like, your finger's kind of turning purple. Why do you have this band across your finger? And he said, well, they took my wedding ring. You know, they took everything from me. But he still wanted to show that he was committed to his wife, who was on the outside. And so he found a way to make his own wedding ring, right? And then later on, you know, I was on the phone with him. He got put into isolation, and he found out there was another Filipino next door, and the next room to him who was someone who was also being isolated. And on the phone, I could hear him try to talk to the other guy, saying, oh, hey, like, there are people on the outside called Tango Migrante. They want to help you. You're Filipino. You should call them. So he was basically trying to organize other people inside. And so while, you know, the conditions are really dark, and the echoes and the parallels, you know, throughout history still are present, the same resistance, you know, there is still resistance, and there are still people who are willing to struggle and not let this just happen. Yeah.
Trying to make just a couple of brief points. One point I'm trying to make in the book, and why it's important to draw attention to things like, you know, these detention centers, is we oftentimes think of anti-Asian violence as some guy flips out in a bar, or some extremist neo-Nazi goes and guns, and that certainly happens, and it's in my book, and even those incidents again and again are called initially not racially motivated, or we're not sure why it happened. So there's a long history of that. But so much of anti-Asian violence and racist violence and social violence in general is state violence, right? It is through militarism, war, but also through police violence and detention. And so there were just been a number of cases, even in the Seattle area, of state violence. Tommy Lee, you know, killing by the sheriff is one example. And they initially said, you know, oh, he was threatening them. They said, no, it was a pen. And then it came out, maybe he wasn't even holding a pen. So I think that's one thing. I think the second thing I really remember was hearing one of the detainees being able to speak over the cell phone at the Liberation Obone. So that was really powerful because, and I was saying, so often the goal is to cover things up and to mask it. And again, I talk about that happening again and again throughout history. You need the labor, you need the violence, you need the racist, scapegoating for political opportunism, and yet then you want to cover it all up. We're in kind of a different moment now, though, where the president just goes out and tweets Chinese and Indian, Americans are products of birthright citizenship and they're ruining this country and they've taken over Silicon Valley and now white men can't get jobs in tech. So it's a new world in which now they're bringing it back into your face in the 19th century again. I mean, they want to undo birthright citizenship. So I think we also need to think about, our job no longer is to just expose them. There's 5 Watergates a day now. So how do we connect this history of overt violence and state violence to what's happening today?
Yeah, that's really great. So I think there's mics here, and if you want to kind of raise your hand, I will just one quick thing to add about that is that part of that barrage of explicit racism, right, is a sense that it is kind of numbing and hard to figure out what to do. And even though visiting a site of detention seems horrifying and it is hard, I think maybe because folks here have been involved in organizing, you already know this, right? But concentration camps from Tule Lake in Minidoka to NWDC are also sites of incredible mutual aid and organizing, right? And to visit those sites, as much as it makes you kind of face things that are difficult, is also really powerful. So I know that the times that I have, it's been longer than since I've been down there. I'm more likely to feel that sense of being overwhelmed, right? By this barrage of what you're getting in the news. And it's the times I go that I always feel kind of renewed. Yeah. So do we have questions?
We have one right here.
Hi there. Thank you, everyone, for your efforts and what you are trying to do to bring attention to mass incarceration. Scott, my question for you is, on the way over here, we're all exhausted and we're trying, we're doing the best we can, and then you find out that whitehouse.gov has been turned into an anti-immigrant diatribe today, and it's terrible. And in your research, what are moments or real true examples in history of actually fighting the system and it worked? Even though it's clearly failing right now, everything is falling apart, but I need a little bit of hope. In the book, I'll get it, I'll read it, but can you give us a tangible example of how we have fought the system?
Yeah, sure. Why don't we take a few questions? Thank you.
Who was your target audience in your mind when you were writing this? Because, there are people who know about this and some people who have no idea about it. And I know it's maybe somewhere in the middle. And my second question is, do you feel a responsibility amid this time when libraries and books being banned, and our textbooks, I'm from Texas, our textbooks are being cleansed. Did you feel a responsibility to tell a deeper story in this piece?
Yeah, thank you. There's one over here, right behind you.
Hi. It's Jade, right? Yeah, Jade's question kind of sparked a question that I've been trying to figure out how to word, but I'll say as a 1.5 generation Taiwanese American, I recently just finished 2 years in a Master of Arts in Counseling program. So I'm now a associate mental health, licensed mental health counselor. And one of my goals is to work with the Asian American community. And in the process of going through, I'm about to turn 47. And in the process of going through 2 years of schooling, I was really contemplating identity and what it means to be bicultural and how it's so ambiguous and broad in terms of where we all find ourselves on the continuum of how we make sense of our identity, and how coming here at 6 years old, having been born in Taipei, all I ever wanted was to be white. Because I'll say, I don't think I would have uttered those words. I would have said, I just want to belong. I want to feel like I'm part of a majority culture. And so we all find ourselves in different places trying to belong. So as I sit here absorbing such an important conversation with so many layers, I'm kind of like, what's actually the thing we're fighting to preserve, and what are we fighting for? Because not to get too existential, but we all do have the ability to oppress. You know, if we say we take ourselves out of the context of being in the US and being in different pockets of the US, and we go to Asia, you know, Asians have fought each other over many, many, many centuries. So it's like, I think the question I'm trying to ask myself is, I want to do something. I think there's different ways to do something, but what is it that I'm trying to do? And I don't know that any one person can answer that question, but I think I am curious, Scott, you having written this book, and you've done so much like thinking and processing of history and information, it's so easy for me to want to intellectualize the material, but I'm thinking that's like not enough. Like, I might not get up and do something if I just intellectualize it. So maybe I'm partly asking for guidance on what's one message that you'd like us to maybe like think about for ourselves to maybe figure out how to take this into something more actionable.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll try to address all these briefly. So remember March 2021, there was this horrific shooting spree in the Atlanta area at massage parlors operated by Asians. And I knew right away, you know, once I just saw the names, that there was going to be some connection to anti-Asian violence. But the first Cherokee County Sheriff's, you know, spokesperson's press conference was like, well, the suspect said it's not racially motivated. He just had a really bad day. And then I saw that reported in a New York Times ticker. And I was like, oh my God, this is ridiculous. And it's not the case that he said, I hate all Asian people, I'm going to kill everyone. But his racism came in because he was raised as a conservative evangelical Christian nationalist. And so he was led to believe that it is his duty to be part of a purity culture, to purify America of its sins. The sins not being racism, sexism, homophobia, the sins being too much third world migration, you know, feminism and gender neutral bathrooms, right? And so he really believed that to be a successful Christian and a white man, he had to raise a family, right? But he had these urges, and so he would go to these massage parlors. But he would only go to the Asian ones because he had held white women up as, you know, I have to marry a white woman, and you know, go against this replacement theory, right? That these immigrants are bringing, and so that's why he targeted Asian women. So it's deeply rooted, right, in sexism, and it's like the whole chapter where I talk about there's a whole culture of sex work and sexual violence around U.S. bases in Asia and the Pacific. And there is a deeper story there that I talk about that requires us to get deeper into history. And so I wanted to challenge the media directly. I wanted to give some tools for teachers, but I really wanted to go beyond just the academic audience and write it in a way that's accessible to someone like me, again, who never learned anything about Asian American history and had my own internalized stereotypes about Asian Americans and Japanese Americans growing up. And, you know, I'm hoping that we can at least put to rest this idea that these are isolated incidents or that anti-Asian racism is not a significant thing. That's the one part of it where, I mean, I can't list every single thing that's ever happened, but there's like 300 pages of anti-Asian racist incidents. But at the same time, right, I don't want it to leave people just feeling, you know, that there's no hope or there's only, you know, we're always powerless. So it does end with a discussion about activism and community organizing. And there are moments, yeah, where we can all come together in big protests, you know, or around an election. But ultimately, getting at the root causes takes building community, grassroots organizing, organizing around schools, around healthcare centers, around affordable housing, around neighborhood forms of safety so people don't have to call the police, strengthening multiracial solidarity, doing that difficult work that, of course, it makes a difference if the president is supporting that rather than encouraging division and hatred. But it doesn't just come from above. It really has to come from below if you want it to be lasting. Like I said, even all the thousands of people that were tweeting and demonstrating about Stop Asian Hate during, the pandemic, the height of pandemic, and millions of dollars went out, a lot of that has now just like gone. And the rest of us who were organizing before all this happened are still having to do that work. And that also, I think, goes to your question that how that organization. And there's another book I wrote with Grace Lee Boggs, and Grace's niece, Tiffany, is here in the audience. Shout out to Tiffany and Grace Lee Boggs. And that's the work we do through the James and Grace Lee Boggs Foundation. So there is another book we wrote together with called The Next American Revolution, which is talking about revolution not as just like, hey, we're going to take over the White House, or we're going to have one big demonstration, but it's about how do we build relationships that model the way we want to live with each other in a whole different system as this one is basically collapsing before our eyes.
Yeah, that's great. Just to amplify that a little bit, right, in response to the question about, what kind of victory can you see? Who is your audience? And this question of identity and belonging, right? I think that, people translate many people from marginalized groups imagine that belonging, the desire for belonging gets translated as desire for whiteness, right? Rather than a desire for a multi-ethnic, multiracial community committed to justice and liberation, right? Which is a thing that you can have, right? Which is a thing that maybe we could have. That the audience is here, right? That the victory in terms of building these kind of relationships and seeing the world you want, right? That is here, right? And it's here, among other things, because we're in the, I'm about to swear, we're in the public library, right? We're in a public library that has the support to do this kind of programming, right? Which is a thing that people actually have to work for and fight for and to maintain, right? But these are the spaces where that is happening, right? That, yes, we're going to be fighting white supremacy for a while, right? Like that's going to be going on for a while. But within that, if you want to see the victory, it's easy for us to imagine that the things that we are building and doing are discounted because we're still focusing on the things that you're fighting against, right? But the work that you have done to bring us together, the fact that we have this space, right, shows that there are these things that already exist.
Oh, and two quick stories to make people feel more hopeful. So one group I focus a lot on, especially near the end of the book, and that was very influential to my development, is an organization in Philadelphia called Asian Americans United. So when I went to college, we couldn't even get the university to change the name of the Oriental Studies Department to recognize that that was offensive. Right? And Asians were so marginal in the city of Philadelphia that there was a refugee from Cambodia just beaten to death on the streets of South Philadelphia. And the police, despite there being witnesses and people who saw it, didn't even move towards making arrests for months. So there wasn't even coverage in the newspaper about it, right? Now, it's not like there's full equality for Asians, but Asians are very much part of coalitions. Helen Gim, an activist, came out of the group, was a major force on the city council. She was a top contender for mayor, and they were able to stop the billionaire owner of the 76ers from building an arena. It was already approved by city council. Even the city council sold them out, the mayor sold them out, but there was so much pressure from the Asian American community and their allies, multiracial allies, that the 76ers owner backed down and is not going to build that basketball stadium. It's just like you imagine, again, we get a basketball team in the NBA, but they're going to build it right, in the middle of the international district, and it would wipe out the community. So they defeated that. The other group I talk about is the coalition. They're originally the Committee Against Anti-Asian Violence. Now they're CAV, Organizing Asian American Communities. They initially tried to raise awareness, arrest these perpetrators, support the victims. Then they decided if we want to get at the root cause, we need to address state violence. We need to create affordable housing as an example of how people can live with more safety and security in the community. And for years, they were struggling to organize at grassroots level, protesting, petitioning, doing tenant rent strikes. But recently, their platform for affordable housing was embraced by campaign mayoral candidate Zoran Mamdani, and now he's the mayor, an Asian American socialist mayor of New York, and they are one of the pillars of his coalition. And so again, it doesn't mean there will be social justice overnight, but it does mean that the work people have done over not just years, but decades does make a difference. And it's really the only thing that makes a transformative difference.
Do we have time for more questions?
Oh, there's one back there. Yeah.
So in like prison abolitionist circles and anti-racist circles, we talk about abolitionism and anti-racism as a practice that you do every day rather than something that you hold. And I guess I'm just curious because sometimes that feels a bit like nebulous, like kind of hard to be like, well, how am I going to practice it every day? I guess I'm just curious for each, all four of you of like what that looks like for you guys in your everyday, like every week, like how that shows up for you guys.
Okay, why don't we make that?
Any other questions? That's a beautiful question. Oh, we
One
have
more.
one here.
Hey, thanks so much. I'm in the middle of reading the book, Scott. It's Tony Wynn. You know, some of the individuals that you highlight in the book, especially those that have been victims of injustice, whether they were killed and whatnot. I mean, as someone that might be a little bit familiar with it, it's still infuriating emotionally, and I'm just like, all right, how much of this can I take in at a time? And so it's kind of related to what this other person was saying, because it's like, well, I'm curious, like, how long it took you to write this, write this book, but then also, what is like, how do you stay sane when you research, over 100 years of very bad, so young person here, stuff that has happened to our communities that, frankly, I'd like a lot of non-Asian Americans to be, hip to this history that's not just the past, but it's our current present as well. So I'm tied to like what are your own kind of like, how do you take care of yourself as you're writing this book or doing this kind of work?
Yeah, thank you, Tony. There's a wealth of Asian American culture in Seattle this weekend. So the Seattle Asian American Film Festival is going on. So Tony Wynn, Tad Nakamura is also here, award-winning filmmakers with great stuff you can check out. It's at the Langston Hughes Center, right? Film festival going on. But I'll let you guys answer the questions first, maybe. We'll just try to be brief. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, these are good questions. Brief. Okay. What I'm thinking about is actually for both questions, just thinking and some of the answers that we've heard, just reflecting on. I think this celebrating the victories is really important, and that is also part of how to put theory into practice. But it's really celebrating the wins and really emphasize. I really agree with building community. What I think about is building relationships and building. For me, it's building the mass movement. So there's not going to be one person who does one single thing where overnight everything changes. It's going to take millions of people doing a million different things all at once, all the time, and then getting there together. Just some concrete examples I'm thinking of, like one recent one has been back in December, Tango Migrante was working with another kuya. He was set to be deported. He was physically put on the plane at SeaTac. And then we were at, right before the doors closed, we were able to get him off the plane and stop the deportation. That didn't happen with one person talking to one other person, but we were working with unions. We were, who got us into the airport through some of their connections. We worked with upwards of 20 medical professionals who wrote in testimony saying that he's not fit to fly. We were working with youth and students who spent the night at the detention center staking it out to watch when he would be taken to the airport. We worked with a team of lawyers who then worked on a petition to file a temporary restraining order against ICE so that once he was off the plane, they couldn't touch him again. It was many, many people doing many, many things, and we were able to literally stop a deportation. And so, taking that and actually celebrating it as a victory of the people was very important. So we can actually share when we come together, we can do something. I think I think that's very important, and it also helps, I think, give life to continuing the work and the struggle. And then in turn, right, the goal is to then make systemic change, right, at some point, to really topple a lot of these just very terrible policies. So I mean, I'll leave it there for that one example. But yeah, mass movement building.
I mean, I think I would really just reiterate everything you said, but I think of one thing that Maru, she is one of the leaders of La Resistencia, and she's been doing this work for her entire life, and probably even longer than that. And she has said this, she said it in Spanish, and then she translated it for me, and it was, the work is urgent, which is why we go slow. And so I think that's something that really sticks with me all the time. Like when, we see headlines every single day of, I don't even know, like just random crap that feels like it's just adding on to this mountain of stress and trauma and hopelessness that feels like just a mountain that's in front of us. And I think understanding that this slowness and this collective work and this community involvement, that is what the idea isn't to necessarily get to the top of this mountain by the time that I'm, by the time that my life is done, right? And the idea is just to continue to go up this mountain. And I think that's kind of that's my daily practice. And I think that also helps me kind of open myself up to community as well. And, this isn't all on my own shoulders. And there's a reason why we have organizations and why we have solidarity. And, yeah, those are just my thoughts, I think, for how I think of things just throughout the day-to-day. Work is slow. That's really the whole point, is that, to build a foundation, it's not going to be fast. And I think that's just, I have to remember that. Otherwise, I will spiral into despair. And I think that's really easy to do. And I think that's also the intention of the news that we hear every day. So
what I would add, I'm an educator, I'm a teacher, and that's primarily what I do. And so that means I'm always trying to sort of figure out how to learn. Suru and La Resistencia, my understanding, both of these organizations have an abolitionist orientation, right? And so for me, learning from them is kind of central to how I engage with what they do. And for me also then, abolition is something that I think of as a set of questions that I find myself always asking, not something that I feel like I've figured out or that I represent. But in particular, the question of how do you fight against something that cannot be reformed, making things better, right? Not just waiting for the day it all falls. I made a joke about white supremacy. I do believe that I will be here when NWDC goes down. Yeah. But I think that how do you, and so this is something that's illuminated for me thinking about the history of Japanese American incarceration, which is something I teach all the time. Japanese American incarceration, Japanese American forced removal was advocated for by people who were kind of old-fashioned exclusionists, white supremacists, America's a white man's country folks, but Japanese American incarceration was administered by liberal reformers, right? And in fact, the work they did to try to, imagine that you could reform a concentration camp made things worse and led to the worst abuses and the worst divisions that have existed in the community since then. And so, understanding that the question is about, facing things that fundamentally cannot be reformed, that need to be replaced, that need to be abolished, right? But along the way, what is it that you can do that is meaningful? And so that abolitionist tendency, that abolitionist thinking is something that is always kind of experimenting and trying to figure out what are the answers to make things better, to sort of shrink the things that need to be shrunk, rather than to reform things in a way that makes them expand their control over life. And so that it is a way of, I think, displacing that sense of you can either be waiting for the day when everything changes or you're just kind of living in despair, or else that you have to accept everything that is meant to be a kind of reform, even when you recognize that that's not going to make things better, that's making things worse.
You know, after Vincent Chin was killed in 1982, the prosecutor, the judge, and all the plea bargaining sentencing, they didn't even bother to interview or talk to these off-duty cops who saw and witnessed this beating and didn't get there in time to stop it. So there was such a sense that the system had was so biased and racist that there was probably slogan was jail the racist killers, right? Similar thing happened in New Jersey. There were a lot of attacks in North Jersey against South Asians. For 3 years, South Asian community advocates tried to get the U.S. attorney for that North Jersey to do something about it. He never did anything. They only finally got charges in one case, and then the charges were basically the guy got off. But for 3 years, it's only when this guy became a judge, Samuel Alito Jr., that they finally even got charges and investigations. So Samuel Alito Jr. was the U.S. attorney who they couldn't convince to act in these alleged hate crimes in Jersey. So, there was a push towards things like victims' impact statements, mandatory minimum sentencing, limiting judicial review, because the sense was in this era of Reaganism, civil rights are being rolled back. John Roberts is getting ready, to gut the Voting Rights Act and other civil rights measures. But we've seen that, of course, more prosecution, more policing doesn't make everybody safer, and it certainly makes black and brown communities and working class Asian American communities, much less safe. I document cases where in domestic incidents, Asian family members called the police. Angela Quinto, a veteran in Northern California, Chambari Zhang in suburban Michigan, and the police came and killed the person they were supposed to help, right? And so, there have to be alternatives, both to build the multiracial alliances, to end mass incarceration, and to keep our own communities safe. And so, I think for me as an educator, I'm working with the Boggs Foundation to do a freedom school in Detroit where we can learn from the people doing this on the ground. But also, I really thought it was important to chronicle people doing the work where instead of needing to call the police, we have in Los Angeles, the neighborhood safety companions that was formed because elders didn't feel it was safe to go get their groceries or go to their doctor's appointments. But then they're also advocating for policies that support those types of healthcare needs and housing needs rather than having, these laws passed for more hate crimes and more policing. And the book ends with an interview with David Monkawa, who did this actual work in the early 1970s when there was this so-called Black-Asian conflict, and some Asian elders felt they weren't safe and needed more policing, and then these progressive younger Asian Americans were saying, we need structural solutions. So he was there in 1972 at a meeting. He was there again in 2022 at a meeting about this. And I asked him, I said, okay, so David, yeah, you were on the streets when you were 22. Now you're 72. Who's doing this? Are you out there in the streets? He goes, of course I am. I'm going to do it till the day I die. And that's how the book ends. And I think that's how we'll wrap up today. And we'll hang around if folks want to talk to us after the event or sign books.